Welcome to I Dearly Love a Laugh, Jane Austen's influential wit and humor. My name is Anna Caggiano, and I work for the Glendale Public Library, and I am the organizer of Pride and Prejudice and Zoom, this free virtual Jane Austen mini-fest. And you are really in for such a treat with the panelists on this panel. We will start the panelist introductions alphabetically with Mark Brownlow, who is a British-born writer, lecturer, and journalist living in Vienna, Austria. His debut novel, Cake and Courtship, is a Regency tale narrated by Pride and Prejudice's Mr. Bennet. He has also written a short story, A Third Proposal, based on a suggestion from me, and two novellas, The Lovesick Maid and The Darcy Ring, which are Charlotte Collins mysteries set in Jane Austen's fictional village of Hunsford. In 2018, he gained acclaim on Twitter with a series of viral literary inboxes memes. A sequel to Cake and Courtship is due to be released soon. You can find Mark at lostopinions.com. Welcome, Mark. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Very excited. Austria normally has very little Jane Austen stuff at all, so.
I'm glad that you're carrying the colors there. There we are. Okay, Amy Cooke-Hodgson, a versatile actress, singer, director, improviser, teacher, and voiceover artist, is co-founder of the award-winning Austentatious, which regularly performs to sold-out crowds. Based on nothing more than a title from the audience, Austentatious is an entirely improvised comedy play in the style of Jane Austen, performed by an all-star cast in full Regency costume with live musical accompaniment. Past works include Bath to the Future and Mansfield Shark. Described by the Times as wickedly funny and by Chortle as one of the most impressive comedy shows, Austentatious's plays are different every time. In Amy's spare time, she enjoys baking and jewelry making under her professional brand name, Rolly & Cook. And may I just add that I am an Austentatious super fan. They're one of my favorite things in the entire world. I've seen them perform multiple times on visits to London, as well as via recorded performances, and give it my absolutely highest recommendation. So welcome, Amy, and thank you so much for coming. I could not be more excited to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is so exciting. I don't feel very academic with the rest of the panel, but I will perhaps bring a slightly left field approach to the discussion.
We're a public library. We don't want it to be too academic. Next we have book hoarder, nerf herder, Jane Austen fan, costumer, social media mage by day, and nerd of many fandoms by night, Bianca Hernandez is a lady of many interests. From fighting for a more inclusive Jane Austen community to ignoring her to-be-read pile, she's always ready for her next nerdy project. She is the co-founder of the former Drunk Austen website and currently runs the website bookhoarding.com and the Facebook group Jane Austen Universe. On weekends, Bianca can be found lightsaber fighting or slowly learning to use her new rapier. Welcome, Bianca. And finally, it's Rose Servitova, an Irish humor writer. Her second novel, The Watsons, a completion of Jane Austen's unfinished work, won bronze at the International SPR Book Awards 2019, while shorter works were runners-up for the Flash Prize and Listowel Writers' Week. Her debut humor novel, The Longbourn Letters, the correspondence between Mr. Collins and Mr. Bennet, was described as a literary triumph. Rose has made author appearances at literary events in Ireland and the UK, including the Jane Austen Festival in Bath, as well as speaking at schools and colleges. She recently curated Jane Austen 200, Limerick, in honor of the bicentenary. Welcome, Rose.
Thank you, Anna. You said Listowel like a native. Fair play.
Thank you for the thank you for the help last night. I was texting her last night, going, "How do I say this?" Okay, so are we ready to get started?
Sure.
Excellent. First question. Have you personally known people you recognize from Jane Austen's novels? Someone who made you mutter, "He's such a Mr. Collins." And how did Jane Austen create such funny archetypes without making them two-dimensional? And who would like to start?
I mean, I would say that my mother is Mrs. Bennet. I didn't think I realized that until I was perhaps in my sort of mid-teens, when I sort of reread the novel and then thought, oh, that's why she's so irritating. It's actually my mother in the book. And she'll probably watch this back now and curse me. But I think, those slightly overbearing matriarchs are, you know, they're prevalent still, aren't they? And you know, I'm still not married, and you know, that probably causes her deep anxiety and stress. So yeah, I think there's plenty of Mrs. Bennets still in the world, my mum being one of them.
I would say there's definitely a lot of Mr. Collinses. Rose, I'm sure you'll agree with me. There's quite a few Mr. Collins out there. I know at least one person who turns almost every conversation into some way of demonstrating how fortunate he is in his position. And you know, every time you talk to him, at some point you're just waiting for it to come. Ah, yeah, there we go. It's the Mr. Collins coming out again. But I think it's more, it's more, but you see aspects of characters in people, and also I find in myself, you read something and think, ah, yeah, there's a bit of Mr. Bennet, there's a bit of, even a bit of, oh, I've forgotten her name. Ah, gosh, Mr. Collins' patron, Lady Catherine. I even find myself a few weeks ago quoting Lady Catherine in a conversation, at which point you sort of realise, maybe you need to take a step back from the whole Jane Austen Regency world and get a bit of a grip mark. If I said to someone, well, I send no compliments to his mother. And that's kind of, no, just that's probably enough.
Yeah, I when I went to university, I'm a country girl and very naive and innocent and whatnot. And I went to a city to go to university, and the girls I lived with, we all lived together in a fabulous house we stayed in for years, and we had great friends and that. But our house was called the Virgin Megastore, and it was, you know, nicknamed the Virgin Megastore for good reason. But anyway, early on in my first year in college, I went down, I was looking for a lecture room, and this other chap who I knew was also a history student with me. And I was always polite to him, even though I thought he was very weird and very strange. And anyway, we ended up in Q-1, which is under the library. It's the basement. And it turns out it was where all the archives were. And we were in the wrong place anyway. And he turned to me and he said, Rose, I have a feeling. And I thought he was going to get sick. Like, he looked like he was going to throw up or something. And he tried to kiss me. And I was like, oh my God, like, you know, he was totally, so he was my total Mr. Collins. He was inappropriate, totally didn't get social, you know, he had no tact and all this sort of thing. And of course, obviously I knew him the whole way through college, and it was more and more Mr. Collinsy he became as time went on. But a very comical character and very ridiculous, but, you know, not someone you want to meet in a basement, you know, so. And there is a nosy woman as well, who I think of as Mrs. Jennings, but she's very funny, and I hope to God nobody I know watches this afterwards. This lady, she's an unmarried lady, and she lives with her unmarried brother, and they're retired now, and they're whatever, and her another unmarried sister. They're kind of, you know, quite funny, and they're very nosy. Like at work, she knows what, she's now retired, and yet she will pick up the phone and tell us what's going to happen, you know, before we find out from management and that sort of thing. She still has her ear to the ground. But apparently someone who lives across the road from her said that when an ambulance passes her house, herself and her brother jump into the car and follow it. Find out what's going on. And
literal ambulance chasing.
So there are nosy characters. So Mrs. Jennings, I find, is a very kind of nosy character, but I don't know that she would jump into a horse and carriage and start chasing a horse. But I don't know. But I love that. I love finding Austen characters and people all around me. So great fun.
Yeah, I think the ones that stick with me are the rakes, you know, the ones that you know, we talked about Mr. Collins, but I think we've all met a Wickham. We've all met this charming person, whether it's like a suitor or not, that turns out to just have been lying the whole time, or a Thorpe that just wants to talk about his car and mansplain books to you, like mansplaining your favorite fandom to you. And I think like that's the like key to it. It's that she writes so closely to people. And also I think a lot is about her core text, which really isn't like overtly Regency, right? Like I think that like unless you know those little key terms, I think you wouldn't be like, oh, she's talking about this exact year. And I think part of that lets you step back and not have to be like, okay, I'm thinking about this exact time period. and have a little bit of that sway. And I think that's what keeps it relevant 200 years later, because you're just like, we've all met a Thorpe. Like, we all have. Even if we haven't gone to a ball, we've met somebody who has been, you know, these parts of these caricatures. And I think, too, she wrote what she knew. Like, whether or not the people who she wrote about read the book and would admit those were them, I think that when you have writers who write so closely to reality, that's when you get the things that you're like, oh yes, I relate to this because it's real. And I think she definitely did that in a way that maybe, you know, a Lady Catherine who might have heard of the book wouldn't recognize herself in it enough to be offended. And I think that's really telling of her cleverness. But yeah, I definitely am always just like, oh my God, like later on in life when I'd reread the books, I'd be like, why did I not see this coming? It's right here on the page. I should have known this was a Thorpe.
What great insights. That's absolutely true. We have another? Okay, sorry. Why do you think Jane Austen's humor is so enduring? Why is it aged so much more gracefully than many other classic writers?
Oh, I can confirm. I think what Bianca said there is extremely pertinent and relevant to that question, because most of the humor is not situational in the sense it relates to current affairs or anything like that. I'm sure there were humorous elements that we maybe don't pick up on now, but most of the humor is poking at people's flaws, poking at characters, laughing at characters with characters, and those flaws that she pokes fun at are just as relevant today as they were 200 years ago. So a lot of the humor when you read it applies just as it does today when in terms of interpersonal interactions, you know. And as Bianca said, if you made the language a bit more modern, you probably couldn't tell which era it was in. It could just as well apply to today, and that's fantastic. And that surprised me. That's what really hit me when I first got involved with Austen. Was I watched the 1995 adaptation and thought, well, the humor, the script writers must have put that in. You know, I'm sure they put that in to kind of, you know, modernize it a bit. But I'll read the book just out of interest to see how much was from Jane Austen, how much from the script writers. And in the very first couple of pages, you've got Mr. Bennet's comment about, you know, the nerves and being my constant companion. And it hit me like a sledgehammer that this was written 200 years ago, and it's just as funny and just as relevant and just as easy to understand now as it was obviously back then. It's fantastic.
Sorry, I just think I'm going to make a very short comment just to say that exactly what you said. I think she was very clever. She didn't attach her stories to situations, to the settings, the Napoleonic Wars or whatever. It was very much about people and characters, and just it was in one room, and then they moved to another room, then they were walking outside, but it was all about the characters. And therefore, I think there will be characters in 200 more years' time, and in another 400 years' time, and that's why I think it's enduring, you know.
Yeah.
And Amy, you had, yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that's actually one of the reasons why our show has been around for as long as it has. We've been doing it for nearly 9 years now. And I think when we first initially thought of doing Jane Austen as an improvised show, we thought maybe we'll be a literary group and we'll do Jane Austen for a year, and then maybe we'll do Dickens for a year, and then we might do Shakespeare for a year. But Jane Austen, I mean, it just has, we haven't stopped. People are so desperate to see the stories, I think largely due to the fact that they are sort of timeless. And although we are telling a story that's set in 1814, it's basically a modern story still with very modern characters, because her characters they're just people, and we haven't changed in 200 years. So, you know, the stories are still very relevant.
And I think there's something to be said too with the connection there about performance, because I think, you know, when we do look back at Austen's earlier years, she was doing these things in front of family, right? She was writing things or reading things or adapting things for the family to read together, because, you know, you didn't have the internet, sadly. You didn't have and, you know, you would have to create these entertainments, especially in winter, you know, when you wouldn't have been going out as much. And I think there's something to be said for how beautiful it is that, like, her works came, you know, she started off being this kind of more farcical, like satirical, theatrical writer, and then that you are now, you know, using her works to do that. And I think that's so telling that like she was thinking about her audience so distinctly. And I think whether or not we want to think about it, and I haven't prepared a whole, you know, much insight into this, but I was just thinking about how it's really wonderfully telling that the cycle came back to performing Austen, because that's really so key. And I think where her brain came from when she approached these works.
Yeah.
Some of it is so theatrical. When we were reading Emma recently in a Jane Austen book club that Hannah and I belong to, that whole scene where Miss Bates is yelling out the window at Mr. Knightley, and Mr. Knightley is yelling back in, you know, and it is just, you can absolutely see it happening.
I like the parts where they just ignore Miss Bates. She goes on a page rant and nobody listened.
Excellent. Now, Mark, this question I think is of a special interest to you. Austen's modern readership comprises far more women than men. Do you think a lot of men are unaware of just how funny her writing is?
This is a question that or a topic I've obviously thought about a lot, because I get confronted with it a lot. I could talk for hours on this, so I'll try and keep it short.
Yes, don't do that.
There's different ways of enjoying Austen. There's the humor, there's the social commentary, there's the story, and there's the romance elements. And in recent years, that last element has come to the fore a lot, especially I think through the adaptations. And all of these ways of enjoying Austen are fine and great, and you don't just have one, you can enjoy Austen in different ways. But with that sort of change has come a little bit of this idea that Austen is not for men, because it's kind of associated with this sort of female-oriented romance element, which is not true, that it's just romance. And what bothers me more, though, is not that men should understand that there's more to Austen than Lizzie and Darcy getting together in the end. There's much more to it than that. But also that it's kind of a wider social issue that men are, why shouldn't men also enjoy that aspect of Austen? There's this idea of what is masculinity is stopping a lot of men, I think, from just enjoying stuff that they would happily enjoy. There's no reason why you can't enjoy Jane Austen, for whatever reason you do enjoy it. And you shouldn't be put off by somebody saying, you know, it's for women. And I think if you look back through history, I'm not an academic either, that the original Janeites were men, I believe. That was the term was first used for men, that the books were read in the trenches of World War I. So obviously there's plenty there to appeal to men. And for me personally, I kind of look forward to a time when as a man, I was going to see if you want to call it that, you can enjoy football and beer and Star Wars and Jane Austen and flowers and watching bees on a Sunday morning, which is my favorite activity. And that's just completely normal and not worthy of commentary. And I'm not sure that many of us are able to do that, because we're still sort of, you know, at the back of our mind is this, oh, you know, am I allowed to enjoy this? And I've seen it myself and with others, that when you do sit down as a man, or with a couple come to visit and I make them watch Pride and Prejudice or a romantic comedy, the man's very often at the front, like, oh, you know, I'm not sure. And then halfway through, they're kind of like, whoa, they're right into it, because it's got great value and engaging and humorous and interesting, and we can enjoy a happy ever after as much as anyone else. But I think the wider problem is this sort of stereotype of what men are allowed to enjoy, and I hope that it's getting better, but I think we still have a long way to go, as I'm sure we all know.
And I totally saw that when I was growing up, like in my in my high school, when we first were introduced to Austen in the curriculum. It was posited like well, this semester the boys' book that we're reading is this book, and we're reading, you know, the girl book is going to be an Austen book, and I'm just like, okay, cool. Lord of the Flies was the boys' book, by the way. Just I can't even get into that one. But, and I think so I definitely see your point of there's societal pressures there. I also think that I actually think plenty of men read Austen. I think that it's more of a, do we openly have them involved in community? Do they feel openly and welcomed in these spaces because of those pressures? I think that's like the second part of it. Because I do think that like romance novels are selling. Like they are one of the highest selling books. And it's like, if you look at your statistically at your friend group, you might not know all the people who are reading whatever. And I think that's because reading is a lot for pleasure for people. And sometimes people don't feel like they want to interact with groups because of societal pressures or because of other things. I think romance is definitely one of the things that have been majorly stigmatized. And I think Austen, as an adjacent romance writer, because of that space that you're talking about, because of how we've interpreted her and adaptations around her work, has become more the romance slot. I think that that has helped stigmatize that for certain people who do have those pressures. But I definitely think that like there's probably a lot of dudes who read Austen, they just maybe aren't comfortable in those spaces, which I think goes back to like an inclusive space where it's like, how can we work then to like make the Mr. Tonleys feel like they can come and talk about Udolpho? Like, let's bring them in, y'all. Like, let's make these, like, who doesn't want a Tonley at your book club?
Absolutely. And Amy, there are so many talented men in Austentatious, Andrew Hunter Murray and Joseph Morpurgo. What do you think makes the difference there that they're comfortable with this?
The two that you just mentioned, so Joseph and Andy, are actually both English graduates. So, and they both did their dissertations in Jane Austen. So they happen to be very much sold on her work as an academic study. We have two other boys who are in the cast. One also is an English graduate, so obviously at university came across Austen's work. And then Graham, who won't watch this because, you know, it's Graham, but he has no interest actually in Jane Austen's written work. He loves being in the show, but it's just, you know, reading her stories is just is not his bag. But having said that, you know, he enjoys very much being in the setting and the time period and the costume and telling the stories. And we often find actually that our audience members are very often, the person who books the tickets are the girls, and they bring along with them their boyfriend, their partner, their husband or whatever, as a sort of almost arm behind the back, forced to come and watch something because it's their turn to choose date night or whatever. You can almost feel at the beginning of the show, there's not an iciness, but there's definitely some of the audience members don't know why they're here or what this is. And then sort of within about 20 minutes, you know, they can relax because it's, you know, you don't have to have read all the novels and know everything inside out and back to front. And I think there is that element with Jane Austen of it being, you know, a classic text. And so therefore it's perceived as, you know, difficult or dreary or hard work. And so I think particularly with male readers, perhaps teenage boys, they get turned off from it because, you know, I don't really fancy having to tackle those obstacles. But of course, we know that, you know, she's very accessible and witty. And I think once boys have realised that that is the case, then they're very much on board. I think I've had, you know, several conversations with men where they've said, "Oh, you do a Jane Austen show? Oh, that must be really tough, really boring, or really dry." And I think, well, that I know that you haven't read her. If you've said that, you know, that's, you know, it once you're in, you're in. Is what I think.
I actually came very late to Jane Austen because they never taught her in school. I was more into Shakespeare, even though I was English major, and I had always assumed, oh, she does the romance. With nothing wrong with romance, but I like humor. And when I actually saw the TV adaptation of Pride and Prejudice first, and then dipped in and was absolutely addicted. So I think it definitely does a disservice when people don't realize how multifaceted she is. And Rose, do you have any thoughts?
I asked my husband actually, because he's into historical stuff. He's currently, it's about 2 years in the making now, making a Austro-Hungarian hussar uniform, which is perfection itself. Like, I mean, he's poured everything into it, thousands of hours making this uniform. And he also reads the Jane Austen Regency World magazine when I get it. And do you know, he enjoys the programs. We were watching Belgravia, you know, which is Julian Fellowes' more recent work and things. Like, he does like the historical things. And I said to him last night, I said, what is it about? Why aren't men generally into Jane Austen more so? And he felt it's marketed towards a female audience, and that's a more modern thing. It's like certain romance comedies and all these sort of things are often marketed more towards a female audience. And I kind of said, you know, he has probably a good point, because a lot of men come in through the back door, through the adaptations or through some other interest. They don't go from the text necessarily. So, you know, he loves everything about the world of Jane Austen. And we have lots of trips that were cancelled this year, which were involving trips to Bath in different parts of the UK and festivals and getting dressed up and things like that. So I think he had a point, actually, that maybe it's a marketing thing, because I never saw Jane Austen as a romance writer. I was so shocked when I was reading that, you know, people said that. I saw the humor, I saw the moral story, I saw everything else she was trying to teach us about life and about, you know, where you belong and family dynamics. And just the romance just happened to be a wedding slapped on at the end. But to me, it wasn't about that at all. It was about everything else, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So do you think Jane Austen would find you personally funny? If she created a character based on you, would you be honored or terrified? And what sort of character would you be? Who wants to tackle this one first?
I would be terrified. I would be so scared for her to write about me, because like we've seen how like even the like most lovely characters, sometimes she can be a little cutting towards them. I would be so scared. I don't know if she would really relate to my humor. I do think that like I've drawn to her humor because it's very similar to my kind of way of seeing the world, but I would be so scared.
I agree.
I think I lend myself to a ridiculous character anyway. I was on some kind of Twitter thing last night, and we had to talk about embarrassing things. The amount of embarrassing things I could write a book, seriously. Ridiculous situations I have walked into. I wore my swimsuit back to front and I didn't realize it. My boobs were out. That was in the Great Barrier Reef. And then I was sitting on the sofa, what I thought was my sister's house, and I was flicking through the channels, all like, you know, reclined out on the sofa, waiting for her to come downstairs. And I was watching American TV and she had the channels and I didn't. And this man came out of the kitchen and he was like, who the are you? And I was like, who the are you? And telling him he was in the wrong house and all this, and turned out I was in the wrong house. And I just have so many of those kind of stories, like where in an interview I sat on the edge of a chair and the chair fell down. I fell with my backside onto the ground and the chair fell on top of me, and the guy was so serious, he was pretending it didn't happen, and there I was wearing an armchair on my head, and he didn't help me. He just kept asking questions. It was just so ludicrous. So I think, and I don't mind laughing at myself. So if she did choose a ridiculous character for me, I'm happy out of that. I would be honored to be up there with Mr. Collins's and the, I don't know, all the other ridiculous characters. So
that's wonderful.
You're welcome. There's a lot more. There's a lot of them there.
You're a good sport.
Bianca, terrified. I'd be absolutely terrified. I just know that she'd write a letter and she'd be describing me and it would all sound really nice, and you know, and then the very last line would just destroy me. There's one little cutting line at the end. I'd be really happy right up to that last line, and then boom, gone. Yeah. So yeah. And as for sharing the sense of humor, I wouldn't dare say anything funny in front of her. Yeah.
We often get asked whether or not we think Jane would enjoy watching our show. And we've had a couple of Jane Austen's relatives that have been in to watch the show over the years. And most, I would say, are absolutely thrilled and think it's brilliant. But we were in Lyme Regis a couple of years ago, and a very old lady came to speak to us with a helper at the end to introduce her, to say that she was, I think she was like a great granddaughter or something, quite extended connection, and she was absolutely horrified. She was so angry, and we just you just have to laugh at it. I actually think Jane would think the show was fun because, you know, as we discussed, she started off in writing little theatricals for home and her brothers, and the whole sort of playful nature of everybody sort of bumbling together to tell a story. I think she'd find it really funny, but some members of her family don't.
Yeah, and her juvenilia was so similar to the way Austentatious feels, that extreme, that almost Monty Python sense of here we are all dignified and then suddenly, you know, a bear wanders through kind of feel to that. So I definitely think she would have enjoyed it. Okay. Do you feel Jane's sense of humor shaped yours, or was it more a case of recognizing a kindred sense of humor? And has her writing helped you befriend other funny people? Who wants? Amy, would you like to start that one?
Sure. I don't know if I would say that it has necessarily shaped my sense of humor. I think when I sort of started seeing her from a comedic point of view, I sort of noticed there were some similarities, and I think I have learnt from her observational humor, definitely, and being able to sort of use that in a show has been really useful. Sort of, you know, being able to make very quick quips about a character in the way that, I'm not saying to the standard of Jane, but in the way perhaps Jane would be able to sort of tear a character down with a very, very short line. You know, I can kind of draw parallels, but I don't think I necessarily grew up thinking I would like to be as funny as Jane. I just don't think I as a teenager, I don't think I saw her as witty. It wasn't until I was much older and I was able to sort of take in her ability to describe characters in such a way that I was able to realize, oh my gosh, this woman is really smart and very funny.
Mark, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I recognize a kindred spirit. My humor was established before I really got to know Jane Austen at all. And particularly, there's certain characters in the books where I think, yeah, that I have to be honest and say Mr. Bennet's humor is very similar to my own. I hope I'm a better father than he is. We would have to ask my kids that.
Yeah, bring in the kids. Bring in the kids. We want to ask them.
But the sort of slightly sardonic, cynical humor matches very well with my own. And your second question was about whether it's brought people together. I mean, one of my favorite books is Roses, which I have here, Longbourn Letters. I think the reason why Rose and I connected was entirely through a common love of Mr. Bennet and Mr. Collins, I think, Rose, initially anyway, at the start. So yes, it definitely, just as, I mean, a love and respect and admiration of Jane Austen brings everyone together. The humor element was a big part of that with Rose, for example.
Bianca? Oh, Amy, sorry. I mean, Rose, not Amy, Rose.
I was just going to butt in there and just say I was going to mention that Mark was one of the people that has brought me, you know, like that as well. It's identifying with, like, I think everyone has a Mr. Collins and a Mr. Bennet inside them. We were all slightly ridiculous and we're all slightly cynical and stuff. But my own humour was established as well before Austen, and I would have been an observer of characters for a long time. And like writers who, you know, but until you become a writer, you don't actually observe your own style. So you don't realise what you're doing. But my own writing would be dialogue heavy, like Austen, and observing characters would be all about characters, really. So I would have that similarity with her, I think, but I don't think I was kind of influenced by her. But I have met some great people, and just to acknowledge yourself, Anna, for putting together, like, I have been on zillions of webinars and things now, but nobody brings on the humor of Austen. Like, there's all these themes about spin-offs and themes about the romance or about this book or that book, but bringing the humor element, it's such a strong part of her writing, and yet I've never seen a single lecture or anything on it. Now, I could be wrong, maybe I just didn't hit on it, but the humor in Austen is massive, and it's great to have a platform or someone that recognizes it.
Thank you. And I have to say that Mark and by proxy Rose were the first two people I contacted going, do you think this is a crazy idea to do this event, or should I give it a go? And very supportive, so thank you so much.
Yes.
And Bianca, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I definitely think that I have met some of my strongest friends through shared humor, and I think that's really telling. And some of the people that I really have stayed friends with from the Jane Austen book clubs I've been in have been people who were funny. And I think it's definitely a thing where, you know, you're drawn to similar things just like in life, right? And I think that's really telling of authors too. Yeah, I definitely grew up in a very sassy, sarcastic household. And when I started reading Austen, it was really refreshing because it did feel like someone else in, like, that would fit in with my family. So yeah, I definitely 100% am like, just like in real life, we're drawn to people like us, or people that we can be like, I'm gonna like elbow you and you know exactly what I'm gonna say, or like who I'm looking at in my like internal monologue. And it's really nice to have that.
Absolutely. Yeah, Hannah and I tend to be partners in crime in that way, so I can definitely empathize. So which funny moment in, oh, sorry, were you? Okay. Which funny moment in your Jane-related creative endeavors are you most proud of? A particular line in improv, or a character moment in a book, or a viral meme that you made? And what is the single most ridiculous thing you've ever done in the name of Jane? I think I know Mark's answer to this one, but we'll see.
Sure, shall I start us off then?
Sure.
In terms of funny, it's when I write from Mr. Bennett's perspective, he throws in a lot of what I would like to think of funny comments on life and people. But I'm kind of most proud of, or most pleased with the way that I get Charlotte Collins to manage her husband, because there's kind of this, like, we understand why Charlotte Lucas married Mr. Collins in the time frame that it was set in, but I kind of like the idea of she shouldn't have to suffer. And with Mr. Collins, there's a very real risk of suffering. So I have a couple of scenes, and each time I write about her, I have at least one or two scenes where she basically wraps him around her little finger. So he thinks he's in charge, he thinks he's making the decisions, he thinks he's taking decisive action, and all the time it's her guiding, and you can sort of smile along with Charlotte. She's keeping a straight face, and that's what I like most. And the ridiculous, Chawton House did a fundraising initiative with the Darcy Challenge, where I put on a white shirt, which I was thinking of doing today. And my wife said if I did that, she'd come in with a bucket of water and throw it over me. And that's what we did. So I did the first line to the Hunsford proposal. My son threw a bucket of water over me. And then when I was trying to explain the fundraising initiative, he decided to take it a step further and let loose with the hose pipe straight into my ear. And I had an ear infection for a week afterwards, which, you know, this is a reveal. I didn't tell you. So I suffered for my art, so to speak, for Chawton House. And also I realized that white shirts and the Darcy persona are probably not me.
I feel so bad because I'm the one who challenged you. So you ended up with the ear infection because of me.
It was all in an excellent cause. The work that Chawton House does is fantastic. So
there we go.
It's cool. It's okay.
Was your son sorry at least?
Oh no, they loved it. They loved it. That was one of the greatest moments of their childhood, I think.
I think you described them as giggling little gremlins on Twitter.
Yeah, yes. yeah. I'm sure somewhere there's a behind the scenes video I can drag out.
Amy, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm trying to distinguish between funny and ridiculous, because I would probably say that they were very, very similar. But I can think of a show in Edinburgh a few years ago when there was a child, a baby in arms in the audience, and they started crying. And in improv, you kind of have to take whatever's going on as an offer. You can't ignore and pretend that there isn't a child crying, because the audience can all hear it. We can all hear it. So let's make it part of the show. So I was playing the maid at the time in that particular show. So thinking that I was a child whisperer, I guess, I walked into the audience and took the child from its parent and brought it back down onto the stage, holding it, and carried on the scene as though the job was now, not only was I with the maid, but I was also now the nanny or whatever, and continued that. And actually the child stopped crying. And it was like a weird, miraculous moment. But afterwards, you know, some of the boys in the cast were like, "What are you doing? You don't know that child. You don't know the parents. You could have dropped it on the stairs." And I just I hadn't thought of any of the health or safety. I was just like, there's a child crying, and I need to include that in the story because it's very important. So the audience loved it, and actually the parents were very sweet about it. And I haven't had a legal letter since, but Yeah, so I guess that's potentially funny / ridiculous. I think another event, we have a cross-dress show once a year called Austentatious, which is a charity show. And so all the girls are dressed up in boys' costumes and vice versa. And I think ridiculous, not in a funny way. I decided to play a character that was basically Boris Johnson. And after about 4 minutes of playing Boris, effectively, I realized that I was then stuck playing Boris for an hour and didn't really enjoy that. So I just had to make him I mean, he's already a buffoon. Sorry, Boris, but it's true. And yeah, so I just sort of had to exaggerate how ridiculous. And by the end of the show, I mean, he was an absolute idiot. By the end of the show, and that's not to do with what he's like now.
Bianca, Rose, either one of you?
I think one of my favorite memes that I still see, and I've made it much better since, but like the first time I made it was, there's a Star Wars May the 4th be with you, because May the 4th, and I made a May the 1st be with you joke, and I very poorly on like a free app on my phone, like photoshopped a lightsaber into his hand, and it's like, I've made much better ones since then, but I still see the first one floating around. It's always very entertaining to me. Because I really made it as like, oh, haha, I think this is funny. And then other people thought it was funny, which is great and validating. But it was just one of those things where I'm just like, oh, like it's wonderful to see that like this fandom has like other facets, right? Like we're multifaceted people, and it was one of those really great moments. I think one of the first moments where it's like, oh, like we should be doing way more cross fandom mashups with like humor and everything, like, and thinking about like even like cross fandom conversations about stuff. So yeah, that was really funny and entertaining. As far as just like things I've done to be ridiculous, I mean, it's hard to parse out. I dress in Regency stuff a lot to do stuff with friends, and it's whether it's going to like the like ruins of the Sutro Baths or other things. I've definitely had a couple instances though where I was not necessarily the Mr. Darcy, but my fiance has thought it was very funny to put on a white shirt and walk into the sea as like a funny haha, and I'm just like, this is the life I've chosen, I guess. Like this is just reflective of all of my life choices.
And Rose?
I suppose the letters of Mr. Bennet under the influence are kind of like, there's 2 of them in the book, and you know, as honest and as pulling the wool over Mr. Collins's eyes that he usually does, he lets even more slip. And I love the way as the letter goes on, the drunker he becomes, and kind of the more he repeats himself in that. And I just enjoyed that, and people seem to enjoy those. So it's all the digs he has at Mr. Collins. I think they were my favorite. And ridiculous, as I said, it's second nature to me. So I have so many examples, but I suppose one that's more cringe than ridiculous is I organised that festival for the bicentenary in Limerick, and we have obviously Tom Lefroy was born in Limerick, and Eamon Vreel Downey, who's the costume designer for, you know, Love and Friendship, Becoming Jane, all this. She's a Limerick woman, and I got her to speak to the local College of Art and Design at all these brilliant events, theatre. And I'm an event manager and I have a background in theatre myself. So I got Whit Stillman to come to Limerick, and like, we were having great laughs on Twitter, and you know, there's all this sort of thing. He's such a great guy, a pure gentleman, very funny, brilliant material, everything like that. But he arrived in Limerick, it was in the middle of a hurricane, and he got off the bus. He had just come from Paris, and he was exhausted and not in good form. And I thought we were like that, and I threw my arms around him in a very, oh, hello, darling kind of way, because I have a background in theatre, and that's how we greeted everyone. And well, he was like Lot's wife. He was just standing like a statue, and I had to kind of unclaw myself and pretend, you know, that the wind had blown me up against him or something like that. You know, he was not in the hugging mood that day. But anyway, he's a lovely guy and a pure gentleman, and you know, we had great fun at it and everything like that, but just not my moment, you know. So I thought Jane had brought us together, you know, because we were soulmates, you know, it just so got it wrong. But anyway. You know.
All of you are on Twitter, and so which character from an Austen novel would you most like to follow on Twitter, and who would you least like to be followed by? Who would make you cringe if they popped up as a follower?
Wickham would be the insta block. Like if Wickham started following me, I'd be like, no, you get out of here, devil. I would block and report him because I know he's up to nefarious things. He's catfishing people. Like he would be a modern catfisher. Let's be real.
Sure.
So I'd immediately be like, no, and like I would screen cap probably. He'd be the person sliding to your DMs too, and I'd screen cap that, send that to my friends, be like, block this person, report him, he's catfishing. As far as favorite characters to see on Twitter, ooh, I feel like my favorite characters that I would love to just like follow are not the ones that would be, I think, tweeting obnoxiously. Like Anne Elliot would be so good at her subtle Instagrams of like, look at me enjoying my life away from you all, you crazy people. But like, I don't think she'd be saying that. She'd just be like, look at the sereneness of my life right now. I think that it would be fascinating though to follow the Eltons on Twitter. I feel like they would be prolific tweeters.
Maple Grove, Maple Grove, Maple Grove.
I think actually Sir Walter Elliot is someone I would follow because he would never follow me back because I'm just too low, you know. But he would be following and just clicking all the celebrities, and he would just be, oh, here's me now, and you know, some celebrity and whatever. And I just think I'd get a great kick out of him. Lucy Steele, Mrs. Jennings, and Lucy Steele's sister, you know, they're just they know everything first, and you know. I don't know. I wouldn't like them following me. I wouldn't like the Bertram girls following me. I just don't know. I think, you know, I'm one of these people that I find magazines, a lot of the kind of weekly magazines, very negative. I find I'm depressed after reading them. And then if I go to the hairdresser a few months later or whatever, like the people that are on the couple, this fabulous celebrity couple with their amazing mansion house and whatever, are now, you know, divorced and they're moving on to someone else and stuff like that. So now they're on with their new boyfriend and he's definitely the one and all this sort of thing. And all that really depresses me. I find it really like, oh my God, this is so sad and so fake. And I think the Steeles and the Bertram girls and that are that kind of fake. You know, I'd hate them to be, yeah, I'd block them.
I think in terms of who I'd like to follow for different reasons, I think I'd love to follow Mr. Bennett because I think he would just be telling it how it is. And he could, you know, be giving you the lowdown on his opinion on what the politics were of the day or whatever. And I'd probably be in agreement with him. I'd also love to follow Catherine de Bourgh because I think you'd be able to get the gossip basically and sort of like the bitchy news. That would be fun. Also, I think the person I would love most would be Mary. I would just love to follow Mary's Twitter because it would probably be the most horrifically dull and boring and intricate and detailed, but awful and therefore quite entertaining. And I actually think I'd be really good friends with Mary.
I think, sorry, just to include Mr. Palmer as well. He's one of these people you'd follow. He would only like make a comment once every 18 months. You'd forget you followed him at all. But when he did, it would annihilate everyone. You know, he would just be so, I'd love it. I'd love to be friends with Mr. Palmer.
I'd actually quite like to follow Mrs. Jennings because you'd have all the gossip from her. The other, but I actually think Elizabeth Bennet, because she's sharp, witty, intelligent, she'd be very amusing to follow, especially a few years later, you know, when she's grown up even more. I think she'd be fantastic. She'd be a good sort of satirical comedy writer these days. That would be great. The person I would really, and I mean, I love the character so much, I keep coming back to him. I would hate to be followed by Mr. Collins because you just know that every conversation you'll butt into, and he will always ruin it for everybody else. So you even some kind of innocent little tweet, as in like I'd post a picture of the bees on the lavender that I've been watching in the morning, and you just know he's going to come in and say something which he thinks is praising you, but is actually mocking the tale. Says, I don't know, something like would be suitable for the servants' quarters at Rosings, and he means that as a compliment. And you're going, well, what do you mean? He goes, no, it's a compliment, but of course you can't hope to compare with. Here we go. Lady Catherine, blah, 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 blah. And after a few times of this, you're just going to have to hit the mute button. You don't want to block him because, you know, it's Mr. Collins, but you can't hear it anymore. So, and of course, following Mr. Bennett would be great. I worry a little bit that he might get a bit too cynical. It would be nice if he could keep his humor and be a little bit more positive about the world and put his wisdom to the power of his wisdom to good use, a force for good rather than a force merely for criticizing everyone around him. But he'd be a good Twitter candidate too, I think.
Excellent. Okay, this next question is completely self-indulgent, but I had to include it because the concept makes me laugh. If you locked Mr. Collins and Mrs. Elton in a room together and let them talk at each other about Rosings Park and Maple Grove indefinitely in a sort of death match, who do you think would survive and why?
Well,
Anyone want to tackle?
I would say Mr. Collins would survive because he just would be too what we would call, say here in Ireland, too thick, you know, too big an idiot, you know, to kind of let it get to him. Whereas I think Mrs. Elton would get hurt. She would take it personally. She would be sensitive. I just don't know that I think he could just do it. He'd see no harm. He probably wouldn't even see he was being attacked. He would just be loyal and like a broken record. And I think it would just go on until she passed out in a heap, you know. Into smelling salt.
It's the honor of Lady Catherine's at stake here. I think he would go to the ends of the world to defend Rosings and her honor in the face of any opposition whatsoever. So I'm absolutely with Rose on this one.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's definitely Collins. He can't read the room because he's just so blinkered. So he will keep going until he is dead himself, probably.
I'm going to go with Mrs. Elton. Like, Collins is afraid of strong women. And to be locked in a room with her in a small space, I don't know. I feel like my money is on her because as much as he is kind of clueless, he also clearly has a weird complex about women that might be higher ranking than him, or at least come off as higher ranking, and also that might be just really strong women. And I think that, like, at the end of the day, that would slowly chip away at him, and she would just end up as the winner.
I can see him crawling out the window now, Bianca, just as you say that. You know?
Just like repelled by it. Like he just can't like climb like
the ivy down the side of the house. Yeah. There's an image.
Perfect.
What about you, Anna? You said he was self-indulgent. Yeah. What's your opinion?
Rereading Emma now, just when I read Mrs. Elton, it's like she's a female Mr. Collins, only instead of being obsessed with somebody else's grandeur, well, somewhat someone else's grandeur, her brother, but still, Mr. Suckling. But it's just that the two of them struck me as so similar, and both as so where they could just talk at each other, not caring if the other person was listening. So I just wondered which one could possibly hold out the longest. So I think you all make really good points, and unfortunately we can't actually lock them in a room and wait for one of the heartbeats to stop. So we're just going to have to to go here. Okay. Next to last question. Which Austen film or television adaptation makes you laugh the most, and is that also your favorite one?
Well, I wouldn't have said that Sense and Sensibility, Emma Thompson's one, was necessarily my favorite adaptation. And yet, when I was thinking about this question, it is actually from visually, Mrs. Jennings and Sir John Middleton, as they are portrayed in that movie, is just so brilliant. When you see them coming to greet their new neighbors, and like the dogs are bouncing around and whatever, it's just the best scene, it's the best acting, it's just absolutely marvelous, and I love it. And I love Sir John Middleton's absolute lack of knowledge with regard Willoughby's character. Oh, he's a fine rider, he's the best rider in England, and he has a great dog, you know, and I'm going to get, you know, all this sort of stuff. Absolutely knows nothing about his character. He would be an interesting guy to follow as well on Twitter. He'd just, you know, be posting photographs of country life magazines and nothing else. He'd be totally dumb when it comes to anything else. And then Mr. Palmer, of course, who was portrayed by Hugh Laurie. And I just love his portrayal of him as well. It's just magic moments, magic moments. I love it. Yeah.
Yes. I just can't believe it. Try. That was the best.
For me, I think one of the movies that brings me a lot of joy when I watch it is the more recent Northanger Abbey. I think there's so much love and teasing that's happening, and it's really fun to me. And of course, like the crazy flashback, like the scenes of her fantasies are always very entertaining. But I wouldn't say that's my favorite. I think much like favorite books, it's really hard because I feel like it's always vacillating based on my feelings and my needs. And where I am in life. And I think, like, for me, Clueless is really one of my favorite adaptations of Austen. I think that it really captures the ethos, like what that book is trying to do, and does it really deftly with making it a modernization. So yeah, I definitely think that, like, I can find amusement in different ones, but for me right now, Clueless is just like such a good adaptation to just put on and get lost in.
Speaking of putting on, I loved the cosplay you did of using Cher's yellow plaid in a traditional Regency gown. That was hilarious.
You got to bring it full circle somehow.
There you go.
During lockdown, we've been doing some live tweet-alongs for watching all the, well, I say all, but many of the adaptations, including things like Clueless. And so revisiting Clueless as an adult, obviously I watched it as a teenager, and to be honest, I don't think I even realized that Clueless was a Jane Austen adaptation at that time. I just loved it as a teenager. And I think I found a lot of joy in seeing the parallels when I watched it this, you know, most recently, and it was glorious. But I just have a really big space for Bride and Prejudice. I just think it is so hilariously ridiculous. And colourful and musical, and I do wonder whether Jane would just adore that, because it's kind of taken all the camp and all the ridiculousness of her situation and then just ramped it right up to 11. I love Bride and Prejudice.
And speaking of the tweet-alongs, they were amazing, and you guys should do more. So, sorry.
I'm going to be very boring, I think, and I can never get past Pride and Prejudice 2005, which gets me into a lot of trouble with the Pride and Prejudice 1995 group.
Hannah's on your side.
Yeah, and both are fantastic, obviously. I kind of think of Pride and Prejudice 2005 as chocolate and a glass of wine, and 1995 as a full meal with wine. And sometimes our comfort watch here is Pride and Prejudice 2005. And I don't see most of the films as being funny, humorous films, but there's a lot of humor in them, but that's not their sort of core. But I do love the little bits in that 2005 adaptation, things like just the way Donald Sutherland says people. He's sort of, oh, people. Little things like that. And the footman when Elizabeth turns up at Netherfield Park, later when the family turns up at Netherfield Park, and he goes, I think the Mrs. Bennet, a Miss Bennet, a Miss Bennet, and a Miss Bennet. There's little lines like that, I reckon. The cringe of Darcy and Elizabeth meeting outside Pemberley, lots of little things like that. Even the pig wandering through the house, which is, as has been pointed out to me by several people, not necessarily accurate. I love that. And Bingley's practicing his proposal with Mr. Darcy in the distance. It's not laugh out loud funny, but it just always makes me smile. It makes me feel better. And these days, particularly just a couple of days ago, we sat down and thought, right, we're going to watch 2005 Pride and Prejudice. We have Netflix. There's millions of hours of unseen TV we could watch. Let's watch Keira Knightley and Matthew McFadden. So who's the best Darcy, Anna? Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm sorry. I'm Perth all the way, but we're not going to get into that. We're not going to get into that.
That's Wishbone. Wishbone is the best Darcy.
Wishbone.
I love that. I forgot about that. Well,
So-
our friend recently threatened us with a hot piece for dissing Wentworth, so I don't want to get into it.
Yes. I'm just curious, Mark, the Mr. Bennett in your head when you're writing your book, is it Donald Sutherland? Is it Benjamin Whitrow? Is it, or is it just somebody of your own creation?
It's actually Benjamin Whitrow more often than not. I love all the performances, and for example, I can't decide between David Bamber and Tom Hollander for Collins. They were both fantastic, and both the Mr. Bennetts were.
David Bamber all the way.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue.
Sorry.
So yes, Benjamin Whitrow.
How about we put Anna and Mark into a
I can
room?
hear his voice.
We're both too polite. We'll just be like,
Anna will win. No, Anna
Yeah.
will win.
Well,
Okay.
one of my great moments of my life was being retweeted by Bianca. She might not remember this. Retweeted because I put a picture up of me being arrested by stormtroopers, and I said, "This is what happens when you say Matthew McFadden was a better Darcy than Colin Firth." And I got a lot of stick for that as well. But being retweeted by Bianca was like this. Whoa! I'm wow. This is,
made it all worthwhile.
I'm suddenly cool for 5 minutes.
I'm a sucker for any Star Wars Jane Austen mashups, even if I don't agree with it. I'm just like, no, you got me.
Brilliant. Oh, yeah. There's definitely some fan fiction there. So last question. And this has been so great. I don't want it to end. Oh my gosh. I was started out so nervous, and now I'm just like, this is lovely. I want you all to be my friends forever. Libraries are all about recommending read-alikes. What other humorous writers do you enjoy? Who would you recommend, and in what ways are they similar to or different from Jane Austen?
I'll throw out a few. So, well, the first thing is I'm a big P.G. Wodehouse fan. So like Jeeves and Wooster, again, probably televised versions are another way to get there as well. But I mean, I do, and I love any books really that are very strong on characters and humor and characters and that. So Jeeves and Wooster, again, very like Mr. Collins and Mr. Bennett, I suppose, in my own book, The Longbourn Letters. The ridiculous comes out when you have someone really intelligent kind of over and back a bit, you know. I love Mark's books. I'm going to mention Mark Brownlow because I do, and I have to say,
Yeah.
I love Charlotte Collins mysteries because I see them. I watch a lot of the. I'm a pure scaredy cat now, you know. Like I'm. Let's say, you know, those, what do they call them? Not soft mysteries, but what are those things called?
Cozy.
You know?
Cozy mysteries.
That's it. That's me. It's Miss Marple, Poirot, all the way. And we have, I'm not sure if you've seen Midsummer Murders and things like that, but that's the kind of thing. And I see Charlotte Collins in that kind of a light. You know, it's just fantastic. There's humor. It's like Death in Paradise. I don't know if you watch that, but it's about getting humor and characters together with a really good storyline as well. And I suppose something that I just want to mention, because I only came across it very recently, I was like, where has this book been all my life? How many people here have read The Blue Castle by L.M. Montgomery? Oh my God. Anna, are you the only one? Okay. Everyone go out and get it. It was a J Knight on Twitter that recommended it to me, and it's called The Blue Castle, L.M. Montgomery, and it's probably the best book I've read since I discovered Jane Austen all those years ago. It is just amazing, and it's, oh my God, it's like a real woman's book, real coming of age. It's just incredible, and there's lovely humor in it as well, and it's set in Canada. And this is the lady who wrote the Anne of Green Gables books, but it's more grown up than Anne of Green Gables. It's just amazing. So I highly recommend it from a humor perspective, but also from anyone who enjoys the Brontes, Austen, any of those. Anna, what did you think of it?
Well, the main character is very Anne Elliot, very much the taking care of people and not being appreciated. And I really enjoyed it. I'd actually come across it because there was a book called The Ladies of, and I'm going to slaughter the pronunciation, The Ladies of Missolonghi, where Byron died. How do you even pronounce that? But at any rate, McCullough had written that book, and there was a lot of information online that this is a very similar plot line to The Blue Castle. So I read that out of curiosity and really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned there about Anne Elliot, it's as if, imagine Anne Elliot, right, at the beginning of Persuasion, being told, you know, you have maybe 6 months to live or something like that. Can you imagine what she would have done? Like, so this is kind of like that. It's like
Exactly.
this, you know, you're against the clock, and you stop giving it an SHIT because I'm not allowed to swear on this call. But it's amazing. It's a great book. Really,
Yeah,
I do.
absolutely. And I love Anne of Green Gables. Ellen Montgomery is really good, I think.
I'm a big fan of Gail Carriger's work, and she has 3 different series. They're all like Victorian steampunk spaces, which I don't know if people would immediately think that's a good read-alike for Jane Austen, but
No,
I
they
think
work.
They work. She's, you know, she's been most often compared to like Wodehouse, but I think that there's a lot of similarities with the very close writing of societal things, especially class differences, and humor around that in her books. And they're just fun, and there are 3 series. They all take place in like for different like level reading too. There's a more young adult kind of like Victorian steampunk spy thing, and then there's like a more romance one that's going to be like for more adult readers, and then there's the Custard Protocol series, which is kind of a little in between. But they're all like, I think there's enough there, and they're all really fun and just delightful to read.
Amy, do you have any?
Yeah, well, I've gone a little bit left field, I think, with my choices. I do quite a lot of tutoring, literary tutoring with sort of 10, 11-year-olds, and parents often ask me, you know, we know that perhaps they're not quite ready to read Austen just yet, but what's the gateway drug? And I often will recommend things like the Little Women series, because I think they are so, again, really astutely written and really great character observations and funny. Those girls are so, am I allowed to say the word bitchy? I've said it. They can be quite tricky with one another, and it's a really good insight into sibling relationships. So I really love that, and introducing to children that sort of level of classic text, but that's accessible and in a world that they understand before they are sort of perhaps a little bit older and able to access Austen. And then in terms of adult reading, I love Steve Coogan's Alan Partridge books. And you might think, how on earth are they connected to Austen? But I think he is, again, as a character writer, so astutely able to assassinate character and himself in doing so, whilst describing other people, and is able to sort of make really clever comment on British society and the class system. And yeah, I just love it. I mean, he's got a new book out now, which I'm actually listening to as an audiobook, and I just can't stop laughing out loud listening to it. It's just brilliant.
Excellent. I'll have to look those up. Mark, I think I know what your answer is going to be, and it's mine too.
Well, I return the favour. There's a reason I have Rose's book with me. It captures the spirit and humour of Austen perfectly, with the interchange between Mr. Collins and Mr. Bennet. But my all-time favourite author, let's call it ex aequo with Jane Austen, is Terry Pratchett.
Oh yes.
Because he has lots of different types of humour, and Anna and I have had a brief exchange on this before. But what he does that Jane Austen does so well is he combines humour with social criticism, social analysis, pointing out people's flaws, pointing out the ridiculousness of certain aspects of society or people. And so he manages that same combination of a good story, a funny story, but also a story that makes you think. And I was rather delighted. One of his books is called Snuff. He pays kind of homage to Jane Austen in it. There's just one small scene where the main character is with a family, and there's a young woman called Jane sitting in the corner writing. And he is very clear that this is kind of, I think, a nod in the direction of a fellow author on a similar sort of road. And it still pains me that we're not going to read any more of Terry Pratchett.
Oh yes.
a great loss for literature and the wider world. He's such an absolute genius.
He is. He was. Yeah. And
And,
I don't want to give a spoiler to that book Snuff, but you can definitely tell it's Jane by the end pun joke from that, which, yeah. Read it and you will find out. But yeah, I'm there with Mark. I love Terry Pratchett so much. I was lucky enough, I attended so many of his events that he started to call me his designated stalker because I was there so often. And I was lucky enough, I got to be his guest liaison for the first North American Discworld convention that took place here in Arizona. And he, as a favor, actually came and spoke here at the library. And that was probably, not probably, that was the highlight of my career, but this is really close up there. This has been so much fun. This has just been brilliant. You're all so funny and just lovely. And I'm so glad we could do this. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. And anybody have any final words? Yes. Do you have any final words? Anybody?
I would say for readers of Austen, like if you're here for the humor and you haven't read the Juvenilia, check out her Juvenilia. I think it's really funny. I think that there's murder, there's fainting, there's everything.
It's so Monty Python. It's so Monty
Python. And I also would highly suggest too, if you're thinking about teaching Austen, I think maybe stepping into the younger works like Northanger or the Juvenilia to get kids into it. Because I think like if I had been introduced with Northanger Abbey first, it would have been really fun. Like I think I would have taken to her a lot quicker. So I think definitely like think outside the box because she's funny. And I think right now like we've talked about here, she's very in this like, oh, she's a romance author. And it's like, well, actually she's really funny and she's a social commentary person. And I think that's a way that you can kind of bridge that for students.
Yeah. And Jane is one of the romance authors that I can really enjoy the romance because it's not that element of sentimentality. It's so clear-eyed and hilarious. So I enjoy that as well. So anyway.
It's been an absolute joy to participate. I have my problem with being a male British person in Vienna, Austria is I don't know anybody. I think that there's a lady called Anna in Salzburg. That's about as close as I get to any other Austen people, and so it's a real relief and pleasure and joy just to be able to chat away about Austen-related issues without checking first. Have you ever heard of Pride and Prejudice? And trying to think of the German words for Pride and Prejudice, so there's a chance they might. So thank you very much for inviting me, and the whole event looks fantastic. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. But in Vienna you do have awesome cake, so that probably makes up for a lot. The pastries.
Yes, I was going to say this is not tea. This is coffee. They made me sign a contract when I got my residency permits to drink coffee and not tea. So yes, it has its benefits.
Any final thoughts, Amy and Rose?
Just to say thank you so much for including me in this. I feel woefully underprepared in terms of knowledge of the subject matter. So thank you so much for including me in this little chat. And I am so in awe of those of you who have studied her work so deeply and are able to write in her style and using her characters. So I have made a list of all the things I'm going to go away and read now that you have written. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And if you're ever in London, do give me a shout and we can try and hook you up with a ticket to come and see the show if you fancy, if the theatres are open.
Yes, I can't wait.
It's fantastic. No, I just like to thank everyone. Thank you for having me. It's great to talk about humor in Austen. And let me see, I was going to say something else. No, that's it. Thanks for not mentioning Sanditon, because that comes up.
Yeah.
And really, the fisticuffs, the gloves come off. It's dirty and nasty and very unladylike.
So we would be violating the no swearing rule.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to bleep everything I say. So thank you for that. It's just been great fun. Thank you. It's been a privilege.
Thank you so much. I hope you all have enjoyed it, even a fraction as much as I have. This has been so great. Thanks so much.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great day.
Ciao, ciao.